The evening air hung thick with humidity as Sarah Martinez stepped out of the small convenience store, a bottle of water and energy bar tucked under her arm. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting an eerie red glow across the empty parking lot. She had been driving for 6 hours straight, making her way back to base after a brief visit to her sister's wedding in Phoenix. The ceremony had been beautiful, but Sarah felt oddly out of place among the civilians, their conversations about office politics and weekend plans feeling like a foreign language after her last deployment. At 28, Sarah carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen and done things most people could never imagine. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore jeans and a plain black t-shirt that concealed the lean, powerful physique that years of rigorous military training had sculpted. To anyone looking at her, she appeared to be just another traveler stopping for supplies on a long road trip. The parking lot was mostly empty except for her blue Honda Civic and a large pickup truck parked near the far end. She had chosen the Honda specifically because it was unremarkable, the kind of car that blended into traffic and drew no attention. After years of operating in hostile environments where standing out could mean death, she had learned to appreciate the value of being invisible in plain sight. As she walked toward her car, Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Her eyes swept the area, noting the positions of the few other vehicles, the location of potential cover, and the exits from the parking lot. It was second nature now, this constant assessment of her surroundings. Her fellow SEALs called it staying switched on, and it had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments in Afghanistan and Syria. The convenience store clerk, a tired-looking man in his 50s, had been friendly enough. He had mentioned that the area had been having some trouble lately with robberies, mostly targeting lone travelers who stopped at gas stations and stores along this stretch of highway. Sarah had thanked him for the warning, while internally noting that she was probably better equipped to handle such threats than most people who pass through here. She clicked the unlock button on her key fob and heard the familiar chirp of her car's security system disengaging. As she reached for the door handle, she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. The pickup truck's doors had opened, and 3 men were getting out. Something about their movements immediately put her on alert. They moved with purpose, spreading out as they approached, and their body language suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Sarah's pulse remained steady, but her mind shifted into tactical mode. She had faced worse odds in Kandahar province when her team had been ambushed by Taliban fighters. These 3 men, whatever their intentions, were about to encounter someone whose job for the past 6 years had been to hunt down and eliminate threats in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. The first man was large, probably 6'3" and heavily built, with the kind of bulk that came from powerlifting rather than functional fitness. His arms were covered in crude tattoos, and he wore a sleeveless shirt that showed off his size. The second man was smaller but moved with the quick, nervous energy of someone high on stimulants. The third man hung back slightly, and Sarah noticed the bulge under his jacket that suggested a concealed weapon. "Evening, sweetheart," the large man called out as they approached. His tone was mock-friendly, the kind of false pleasantness that predators use to get close to their victims. "Nice night for a drive, isn't it?" Sarah's hand rested casually on her car door, but she had already calculated the distance to each man and identified their most likely attack vectors. Her own concealed carry weapon, a compact Glock 19, was holstered at the small of her back under her t-shirt. She also had a knife clipped inside her waistband and another smaller blade in her boot. But weapons were only one part of her arsenal. Her hands, trained in close-quarters combat techniques refined over years of special operations training, were equally deadly. "Just passing through," Sarah replied evenly, her voice calm and controlled. She had learned long ago that appearing nervous or afraid only encouraged predators. Better to project confidence and hope they would move on to easier prey. "Oh, I don't think so," the large man said, his false smile fading. "See, we've been watching you. Pretty little thing like you, all alone out here. We think you might want to hang around for a while, maybe get to know us better." The smaller man giggled, a high-pitched sound that confirmed Sarah's suspicion about his drug use. "Yeah, we're real friendly," he added, reaching into his pocket and producing a switchblade. The blade snicked open with a metallic click that echoed across the empty parking lot. Sarah's assessment of the situation crystallized. These were not sophisticated criminals or trained fighters. They were opportunistic predators who had grown accustomed to terrorizing defenseless civilians. They had no idea that they were approaching someone who had spent the last month on a classified mission in Syria, where she had eliminated a high-value target from a distance of 800 meters with a single shot from her sniper rifle. "Look," Sarah said, keeping her voice reasonable and non-threatening, "I'm not looking for any trouble. I just want to get back on the road." The large man laughed, a harsh sound full of malice. "Oh, you're not going anywhere, honey. At least not until we're done with you." As the three men closed the distance, Sarah's mind was already working through her options. She could draw her pistol and end this confrontation in seconds, but discharging a firearm would bring police, questions, and complications. Her commanding officer had stressed the importance of maintaining a low profile during her leave. A shooting incident, even a justified one, would generate paperwork and investigations that could compromise ongoing operations. Hand-to-hand combat was preferable, but she would need to disable all three men quickly before any of them could draw weapons or call for help. She had done similar takedowns during raid operations, but those had been in carefully planned missions with backup nearby. Here, she was on her own. The convenience store clerk was visible through the window, but he appeared to be focused on his magazine and hadn't noticed what was developing in his parking lot. The highway was busy enough that cars passed regularly, but none were slowing down. For all intents and purposes, Sarah was isolated with three men who clearly intended her harm. "I'm going to give you one chance to walk away," Sarah said, her voice carrying a new edge that had made Taliban commanders in Afghanistan nervous when they heard it during interrogations. "Get back in your truck and drive away, and this doesn't have to go any further." The large man's eyes narrowed. There was something different about this woman, something that didn't match the easy victim profile they had expected. But he had committed to this course of action, and backing down now would make him look weak in front of his companions. "You threatening us, sweetheart?" he asked, taking another step closer. "Because I think you might be confused about who's in charge here." Sarah's stance shifted almost imperceptibly, her weight settling onto the balls of her feet, her hands relaxing at her sides. To an untrained observer, she might have appeared to be giving up, preparing to submit. But her body was actually coiling like a spring, every muscle group preparing for explosive action. The smaller man with the knife was bouncing slightly on his toes, clearly agitated and eager for violence. The third man had moved to flank her, trying to get behind her left side. It was a basic pincer movement, the kind of amateur tactic that might work against a panicked civilian, but was laughably predictable to someone with her training. "Last chance," Sarah said quietly. The large man reached out to grab her arm, confident that his size and the presence of his two companions had intimidated this lone woman into submission. He had terrorized dozens of victims in similar circumstances, and they had all eventually broken down and begged for mercy. He had no way of knowing that the woman standing in front of him had parachuted into hostile territory at night, infiltrated enemy compounds, and eliminated targets that entire armies had failed to neutralize. She had earned her place among the most elite special operations forces in the world by proving herself capable of handling any threat, regardless of the odds. As his hand moved toward her, Sarah's training took over. The months of conditioning, the thousands of hours of practice, the real-world experience of life-or-death combat, all condensed into a moment of perfect clarity. She was no longer Sarah Martinez from San Antonio, Texas, visiting her sister's wedding. She was Petty Officer First Class Martinez, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, and these three men had just made the worst mistake of their lives. The convenience store's security camera would later capture what happened next, though the recording would be classified and locked away in a federal database. The three men who approached a lone woman in a parking lot, expecting easy prey, We're about to discover why threatening a Navy SEAL is a mistake that very few people live to regret. The large man's hand was inches from her arm when Sarah moved. Her response was so swift and precise that the security footage would later need to be slowed down for investigators to follow the sequence of actions. Years of hand-to-hand combat training, refined through real-world applications in the most dangerous environments on Earth, translated into movements that seemed almost supernatural in their speed and efficiency. But that was just the beginning. The three predators who had surrounded her in the parking lot had no idea that they were facing someone whose job description included phrases like direct action mission and high-value target elimination. They had approached what they thought was a vulnerable civilian, but instead had cornered one of the most dangerous human beings on the planet. The night was about to become very educational for everyone involved. The large man's fingers never made contact with Sarah's arm. In a movement that had been drilled into her muscle memory through countless hours of training at the Naval Special Warfare Center, she pivoted on her left foot while simultaneously bringing her right elbow up in a sharp arc. The strike connected with devastating precision just below his rib cage, targeting a pressure point that would temporarily paralyze his diaphragm and leave him gasping for air. The blow landed with the kind of force that comes from understanding exactly how the human body works and how to exploit its weaknesses. Sarah had learned these techniques from the best close-quarters combat instructors in the military, men and women who had refined their skills through decades of actual combat experience. The strike was designed not just to incapacitate, but to do so in a way that would prevent her attacker from calling out or alerting others. The large man doubled over, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water as his body struggled to remember how to breathe. His eyes widened in shock and confusion. In all his years of intimidating and attacking victims, no one had ever responded like this. The woman he had thought was helpless had just dropped him with a single strike that he hadn't even seen coming. But Sarah wasn't finished with him. As he bent forward, gasping for air, she brought her knee up sharply, connecting with his nose with a sickening crunch. Blood exploded across his face as cartilage shattered, and he toppled backward, unconscious before he hit the asphalt. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds. The smaller man with a knife stood frozen for a moment, his drug-addled brain struggling to process what had just happened. His larger companion, who had seemed so confident and threatening just moments before, was now lying motionless on the ground with blood pooling around his head. The woman they had planned to victimize was standing over him, her posture calm and controlled, as if she had just swatted an annoying insect. "What the hell?" the smaller man screeched, raising his switchblade and lunging forward with wild, uncoordinated swipes. His movements were predictable and clumsy, the desperate flailing of someone who had never been in a real fight against a trained opponent. Sarah had faced knife-wielding enemies before in close-quarters combat situations where a moment's hesitation could mean death. She had been trained by experts who had studied blade combat techniques from around the world, from Filipino martial arts to Israeli Krav Maga. Disarming a panicked drug user with a cheap switchblade was almost insultingly easy. She sidestepped his clumsy attack, grabbed his wrist, and applied a joint lock that she had learned from a former Marine Raider instructor. The technique was simple but brutally effective, using leverage and anatomy to turn the attacker's own strength against him. The smaller man screamed as his wrist bones ground together under the pressure, and the knife clattered to the ground. Without releasing the joint lock, Sarah spun him around and applied a blood choke, cutting off the flow of oxygenated blood to his brain. It was a technique that could render someone unconscious in seconds without causing permanent damage, provided it was applied correctly. Sarah had used similar holds to quietly neutralize sentries during infiltration missions, where making noise could compromise an entire operation. The smaller man struggled briefly, his free hand clawing at her arm, but his drug-impaired coordination was no match for her precise technique. Within seconds, his struggles weakened, and then stopped entirely as he slumped into unconsciousness. Sarah lowered him to the ground carefully, checking his pulse to ensure he was still alive, but would remain unconscious for several minutes. The third man, who had been trying to flank her, now found himself facing a situation that had spiraled completely out of his control. His two companions were down, and the woman they had planned to assault was standing calmly between them, seemingly unharmed and completely in control of the situation. The bulge under his jacket suddenly felt very heavy as he realized he might need to escalate this far beyond what they had originally planned. "Stay back," he shouted, reaching under his jacket and pulling out a small caliber pistol. His hands were shaking as he pointed it at Sarah, and she could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "I'll shoot you. I swear I will." Sarah's expression didn't change as she assessed this new threat. The weapon appeared to be a .25 caliber pocket pistol, probably cheap and poorly maintained. The man holding it clearly had no formal training in firearms handling. His grip was wrong, his stance was unstable, and his finger was on the trigger rather than alongside it. Even if he managed to fire, his accuracy would be questionable at this distance. More importantly, Sarah had been shot at by trained snipers, automatic weapons, and rocket-propelled grenades. She had operated in environments where incoming fire was a daily occurrence. A nervous amateur with a small caliber handgun was not the kind of threat that would make her lose sleep. "You don't want to do that," Sarah said calmly, raising her hands slightly in what appeared to be a surrender gesture. In reality, she was positioning herself for a disarm technique that she had practiced hundreds of times with live ammunition. The key was to move when her attacker was focused on talking rather than shooting. "Shut up," the man screamed. "Just shut up. You messed up my friends, but I got the gun now, so you're going to do exactly what I say." Sarah noticed that his voice was cracking with stress and fear. Good. Frightened people made mistakes, and mistakes created opportunities. She had learned to read the stress indicators in hostile personnel during interrogation training. Rapid breathing, excessive perspiration, tremor in the voice, and unstable weapon handling all indicated that this man was near his breaking point. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice calm and reasonable. She was buying time, letting him think he was in control while she positioned herself for her next move. Her weight was balanced, her muscles relaxed, but ready to explode into action. She had disarmed gunmen before, in dark rooms and hostile compounds where failure meant death. "I want you to get down on your knees," he demanded, gesturing with the pistol. "And don't try any more of that martial arts stuff, because I'll put a bullet in you before you can move." Sarah appeared to comply, slowly lowering herself toward the ground. But as she moved, she was calculating angles and distances. The man was approximately 8 feet away, well within the range where a trained individual could close the distance and disarm an attacker before they could react. She had practiced this exact scenario countless times in the shoot house at Dam Neck, Virginia, where SEAL Team 6 conducted their most advanced close-quarters combat training. The gunman's confidence seemed to return as he watched her kneel down. He had regained control of the situation, or so he thought. His two companions were unconscious and bleeding, but he had the weapon now. This woman, whatever fighting skills she might have, couldn't argue with a gun pointed at her head. "That's better," he said, his voice steadying as he felt the power shift back in his favor. "Now you're going to do exactly what I tell you, or I'm going to blow your pretty head off." Sarah remained motionless, her hands visible, her posture non-threatening. To an observer, she might have appeared defeated, finally cowed by the threat of lethal force. But her mind was running through the tactical sequence she would need to execute. Move left, grab the gun hand, control the weapon, neutralize the threat. She had done it before in real combat situations where hesitation meant death. The convenience store clerk had finally noticed the commotion in his parking lot. She could see him through the window, reaching for what was probably a telephone to call the police. Help would be coming, but it would take several minutes for officers to arrive. She needed to resolve this situation before it escalated further. "Please," Sarah said, injecting a note of fear into her voice that was completely artificial. "I don't want any trouble. Just take my wallet and let me go." The man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the empty parking lot. "Oh, sweetheart, we're way past that now. You hurt my friends, so now you're going to pay for it. And payment is going to take a long time." He stepped closer, the pistol wavering as his confidence grew. This was exactly what Sarah had been waiting for. The closer he got, the easier it would be to disarm him before he could react. She had learned to be patient in hostile environments, to wait for the perfect moment when the enemy's guard was down. As the gunman approached, his weapon now only 5 feet from her head, Sarah's training took over completely. She was no longer thinking consciously about her actions. Her body was responding with the automatic reflexes that had been programmed through years of repetitive practice. The same reflexes that had allowed her to clear rooms full of armed terrorists without taking casualties. The man's finger tightened on the trigger as he prepared to make his final demands. He had no idea that the woman kneeling in front of him had eliminated enemy combatants in similar positions, often in complete darkness while under fire from multiple directions. He was about to learn that pointing a gun at a Navy SEAL is the kind of mistake that people rarely survive to tell others about. Sarah's muscles tensed imperceptibly as she prepared to move. In her mind, she could hear the voice of her close-quarters combat instructor: speed, surprise, and violence of action. The enemy can't react to what they don't see coming. The gunman leaned forward slightly, bringing the weapon closer to her head, and Sarah knew the moment had arrived. Everything that happened next would be determined by training, reflexes, and the kind of combat experience that very few people in the world possessed. The parking lot was about to become a classroom, and the lesson would be one that these criminals would never forget, assuming any of them survived it. Sarah's body moved with the fluid precision of a machine designed for warfare. In one explosive motion, she pivoted left while simultaneously rising from her kneeling position, her left hand sweeping up to deflect the gun barrel away from her head, while her right hand shot forward to control the gunman's wrist. The technique was called a redirect and control, and she had practiced it thousands of times until it became as natural as breathing. The gunman's eyes widened in shock as his weapon was suddenly pointing at empty air instead of his target. His finger convulsed on the trigger, and the small pistol barked once, the bullet whining harmlessly into the night sky. The muzzle flash illuminated Sarah's face for a split second, revealing an expression of cold, professional focus that would have been familiar to her teammates, but was terrifying to see from someone who moments before had appeared helpless. Before the echoes of the gunshot had faded, Sarah had completed her disarm sequence. Her right hand twisted the gun from his grip, while her left elbow drove into his solar plexus with devastating force. The man doubled over, gasping, and Sarah brought her knee up into his face with the same precision she had used on his larger companion. The crack of breaking bone was audible across the parking lot. The gunman crumpled to the asphalt, unconscious and bleeding from his shattered nose. Sarah stood over him, the small pistol now in her hand, and quickly ejected the magazine and racked the slide to clear the chamber. The round that ejected glinted in the streetlight before bouncing across the pavement. She field-stripped the weapon with practiced efficiency, scattering the components across the parking lot to render it useless. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 2 minutes. 3 men who had approached what they thought was an easy victim now lay unconscious and bleeding, never having landed a single blow or posed any real threat to their intended target. Sarah stood among them, her breathing steady, her pulse only slightly elevated from the brief physical exertion. As the adrenaline began to subside, Sarah's mind shifted into post-action assessment mode. She quickly checked each of her attackers to ensure they were still breathing and in no immediate danger of choking on their own blood. Despite what they had planned to do to her, she had no intention of letting any of them die. Her rules of engagement, even in a civilian context, included proportional response and preservation of life when possible. The convenience store clerk was now standing in his doorway, speaking rapidly into his cell phone. Sarah could hear fragments of his conversation. 3 men, woman, unconscious, send ambulance. The local police and emergency medical services would be arriving soon, which meant she needed to prepare her explanation for what had occurred. Sarah retrieved her own cell phone and speed dialed a number that connected her to a 24-hour secure line at Naval Special Warfare Command. When a voice answered, she identified herself by her operational call sign and briefly outlined the situation. Within minutes, she would have legal representation and official support for what was clearly a case of justified self-defense. But she knew from experience that civilian law enforcement could be suspicious of anyone with her particular skill set. While she waited for the authorities to arrive, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. 6 years earlier, she had been Sarah Martinez, a college student studying criminal justice at the University of Texas. She had been a competitive swimmer and had always been physically fit, but she had never imagined herself in military service. That changed on September 11th, when she watched the towers fall on a television screen in her dormitory common room. The decision to enlist hadn't been emotional or impulsive. Sarah had researched military occupational specialties for months, studying the requirements and opportunities available to women in combat roles. When she learned that Naval Special Warfare had opened certain positions to female candidates, she knew she had found her calling. The idea of serving in one of the most elite units in the military appealed to her competitive nature and desire to test her limits. Basic training at Great Lakes had been challenging, but manageable for someone with her athletic background. The real test came when she applied for and was accepted to basic underwater demolition/SEAL training at Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, California. BUD/S was designed to push candidates beyond their breaking points, to separate those who merely wanted to be SEALs from those who had the physical and mental toughness to actually do the job. The statistics were sobering. Of the 32 candidates who started with Sarah's class, only 6 graduated. The attrition rate was even higher for female candidates, who faced not only the same physical challenges as their male counterparts, but also the additional burden of proving themselves in a previously all-male environment. Sarah had thrived under the pressure. The endless physical training, the sleep deprivation, the mental challenges designed to break down candidates' psychological defenses had only strengthened her resolve. She discovered that she possessed something that couldn't be taught or faked: the ability to function at peak effectiveness when exhausted, stressed, and under extreme pressure. Hell Week had been the defining experience of her military career. For 5.5 days, she and her fellow candidates were subjected to continuous physical training with minimal sleep and food. They carried heavy logs, swam in frigid ocean water, and endured hours of physical punishment designed to make them quit. The instructors paid special attention to her, questioning whether a woman belonged in such an elite unit. Sarah's response had been to outperform many of her male classmates. She was never the strongest or the fastest, but she was consistently in the top tier of performers, and she never gave the instructors any excuse to question her determination. When other candidates rang the bell to quit, she kept going. When exhaustion made her legs shake and her vision blur, she found reserves of strength she didn't know existed. The night evolution that sealed her reputation among her classmates occurred during the 4th night of Hell Week. The class was conducting small boat operations in heavy surf, navigating their rubber craft through dangerous conditions in complete darkness. One of the boats capsized, throwing its crew into the churning water. Sarah, despite being in a different boat, immediately dove into the ocean to assist in the rescue. She found one of her classmates, a large man from Alabama named Peterson, unconscious and sinking beneath the waves. Peterson outweighed her by 80 pounds and was dead weight in the water, but Sarah managed to keep him afloat while swimming towards shore. The rescue took nearly 20 minutes in rough conditions that had already claimed several boats, but she never wavered or called for additional help. Peterson survived and went on to graduate with the class. He later told anyone who would listen that Sarah Martinez had saved his life and that he would trust her with his back in any situation. That kind of endorsement from a respected peer was worth more than any official commendation. After graduation from BUD/S, Sarah had been assigned to SEAL Team 3, where she underwent additional specialized training in advanced weapons handling, close-quarters combat, and counterterrorism operations. Her instructors quickly recognized her aptitude for precision shooting, and she was selected for additional training as a designated marksman. The sniper course at Marine Corps Scout Sniper School had been another crucible. For 10 weeks, Sarah learned the art and science of long-range precision shooting. She studied ballistics, weather effects, and target identification. She learned to calculate wind speed and direction by observing environmental indicators. Most importantly, she learned to control her breathing, her heartbeat, and her mind to make shots that could determine the success or failure of an entire mission. Her first deployment to Afghanistan came just 18 months after graduation from BUD/S. Sarah found herself operating in the mountains of Kunar province, conducting reconnaissance missions and direct action raids against Taliban leadership. The environment was harsh and unforgiving, but it was also where she discovered that all her training had been worthwhile. The mission that established her reputation within the special operations community occurred during her second deployment. Intelligence had located a high-value target, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces. The compound where he was hiding was too well defended for a conventional assault, but satellite imagery showed a possible sniper position on a ridgeline 800 meters away. Sarah had volunteered for the shot, despite the extreme range and challenging conditions. The target would be visible for only seconds as he moved between buildings, and wind conditions in the mountainous terrain were constantly changing. She spent 6 hours in position, studying the environment and calculating her shot before the opportunity finally presented itself. When the target appeared, Sarah had less than 3 seconds to acquire him in her scope and fire. The shot was perfect, eliminating the threat with a single round while his guards were still trying to figure out where the gunfire had originated. The successful mission saved countless coalition lives and removed a key enemy leader from the battlefield. Word of her precision shooting abilities spread throughout the special operations community, and Sarah found herself in increasing demand for missions requiring long-range precision fires. She had conducted similar operations in Syria, Iraq, and Somalia, always delivering when her teammates counted on her. But it wasn't just her shooting skills that made her valuable to her unit. Sarah had proven herself equally capable in close-quarters combat, underwater operations, and direct action raids. She had participated in dozens of missions where split-second decisions meant the difference between success and catastrophe, life and death. The sound of approaching sirens brought Sarah back to the present. 3 police cars were turning into the parking lot, their red and blue lights painting the scene in alternating colors. She placed her hands where they would be clearly visible and prepared to explain what had happened to officers who would probably have difficulty believing that one woman had single-handedly defeated 3 armed attackers. As the first officer approached with his weapon drawn, Sarah reflected on the irony of the situation. She had survived firefights with Taliban insurgents, had eliminated enemy combatants from impossible distances, and had completed missions in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. But tonight, 3 small-time criminals had provided her with more excitement than she had expected from a simple drive home from her sister's wedding. The unconscious men around her were beginning to stir, moaning as they regained consciousness. They would wake up to find themselves in handcuffs, facing charges of attempted robbery and assault. More importantly, they would wake up with the knowledge that they had seriously misjudged their intended victim. Sarah knew that the story of what happened in this parking lot would spread through the criminal community. Word would get out that there was a woman traveling these highways who was not the easy prey she appeared to be. With any luck, other predators would think twice before approaching lone female travelers, at least in this area. As the police officer ordered her to the ground, Sarah complied calmly and professionally. She knew that the situation would be sorted out once her identity and background were verified, but she also understood that law enforcement had to treat everyone as a potential threat until they could determine what had actually occurred. The three men who had approached her expecting an easy victim were about to discover that attacking a Navy SEAL had consequences that would follow them for a very long time. The lead police officer was a veteran named Detective Ray Coleman, who had been working these highways for 15 years. He had seen plenty of robbery attempts, domestic disputes, and drug-related violence, but the scene in the convenience store parking lot was unlike anything in his experience. Three large men lay unconscious and injured around a lone woman who appeared completely unharmed and utterly calm. "Ma'am, I need you to lie face down on the ground with your hands behind your head," Detective Coleman ordered, his weapon still drawn but pointed toward the ground. His tone was professional but cautious. The woman complied immediately, moving with the kind of smooth precision that suggested familiarity with law enforcement procedures. As additional officers secured the scene and called for ambulances, Detective Coleman couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. The three unconscious men were all significantly larger than the woman they had apparently attacked. The injuries they had sustained were precise and devastating, suggesting someone with extensive hand-to-hand combat training. Yet the woman appeared to be in her late 20s, well-educated, and completely cooperative with his investigation. "What's your name?" Coleman asked as another officer handcuffed the woman as a precautionary measure. "Sarah Martinez," she replied calmly. "I'm active duty military, and I need to inform you that I've already contacted my command structure about this incident. Legal representation will be arriving shortly." Detective Coleman frowned. Military personnel were usually straightforward to deal with, but something about this situation felt far more complex than a simple self-defense case. The level of damage the woman had apparently inflicted on three armed attackers suggested training that went well beyond basic military service. The convenience store clerk, whose name was Frank Morrison, provided the first piece of the puzzle. He had witnessed most of the confrontation through his store window and had managed to record part of it on his cell phone. The footage clearly showed the three men approaching and threatening the woman, and her subsequent actions in defending herself. "I've never seen anything like it," Morrison told Detective Coleman as they reviewed the cell phone video. "These guys were big, and they had weapons. The big one must have been 6'3", easy. But she dropped him like he was nothing. One hit, and he was down and out." The video quality was poor due to the lighting conditions, but it clearly established that the woman had acted in self-defense against multiple attackers. More importantly, it showed the incredible speed and precision with which she had neutralized each threat. Coleman had been trained to recognize different fighting styles, and what he was seeing suggested military close-quarters combat training of the highest level. The EMTs arrived and began treating the three unconscious men. The largest one, whose name was Marcus Webb according to his driver's license, had a shattered nose and possible concussion. The smaller man, identified as Tommy Garrett, had a dislocated wrist and bruising around his throat consistent with a blood choke. The third man, Ryan Foster, who had been carrying the pistol, had facial fractures and was still semi-conscious. All three men had extensive criminal records. Webb had convictions for assault, robbery, and drug trafficking. Garrett had been arrested multiple times for possession with intent to distribute and had served 2 prison terms. Foster had a history of armed robbery and weapons violations. They were exactly the kind of predators who preyed on lone travelers along remote highways. As the EMTs worked, Detective Coleman noticed that the woman's injuries were minimal. She had some minor abrasions on her knuckles and what appeared to be a small tear in her t-shirt, but she was otherwise unharmed. Given the size and number of her attackers, this seemed almost impossible unless she possessed exceptional fighting skills. Detective Coleman, a new voice interrupted his thoughts. Coleman turned to see a man in an expensive suit approaching the scene. The man displayed credentials identifying him as Commander James Mitchell, Judge Advocate General's Corps, United States Navy. "I'm here representing Petty Officer Martinez," Commander Mitchell announced. "I understand she was involved in a self-defense incident this evening." "Petty Officer?" Coleman repeated. He had been expecting a lawyer, but not a military officer. What exactly is her military occupation? Commander Mitchell's expression remained carefully neutral. Petty Officer Martinez is assigned to Naval Special Warfare Command. Due to the nature of her duties, many details of her military service are classified, but I can confirm that she has extensive training in defensive tactics and is authorized to use necessary force to protect herself and others. Detective Coleman felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Naval Special Warfare meant SEALs, which explained a great deal about what had happened in the parking lot. But female SEALs were extremely rare, and their existence was not widely publicized for operational security reasons. "Can you remove the handcuffs now?" Commander Mitchell asked politely. Petty Officer Martinez has been fully cooperative, and the evidence clearly shows she acted in lawful self-defense. Coleman nodded to one of his officers, who unlocked Sarah's handcuffs. She stood slowly, rubbing her wrists where the metal had chafed, but her expression remained calm and professional. She had been through far more intense interrogations during survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training. "Can you walk me through what happened?" Detective Coleman asked, pulling out his notebook. He was genuinely curious about how one woman had defeated 3 armed men so decisively. Sarah's account was concise and factual. She described how the 3 men had approached her, made threatening statements, and displayed weapons. She explained that she had attempted to de-escalate the situation verbally before being forced to defend herself. Her description of the actual combat was clinical and precise, using terminology that Coleman recognized from his police defensive tactics training. "You said you tried to convince them to leave," Coleman noted. "What made you think you could handle 3 armed men if they didn't back down?" Sarah's expression didn't change, but Commander Mitchell stepped forward. "Detective Petty Officer Martinez has received extensive training in personal protection and has operational experience in hostile environments. She assessed the threat level and responded appropriately within the bounds of self-defense law." What Commander Mitchell didn't say, but what Detective Coleman was beginning to understand, was that Sarah Martinez was not an ordinary sailor. Her calm demeanor, her precise terminology, and the devastating effectiveness of her response suggested someone with training that most military personnel never received. As they spoke, one of Coleman's officers approached with information he had gathered from running Sarah's identification through various databases. "Detective, you might want to see this," the officer said quietly, handing him a printout. The document contained Sarah's basic military record, though most of the details were redacted or classified. What wasn't classified was impressive enough. Multiple combat deployments, numerous commendations for valor, and assignment to units whose names Coleman recognized from news reports about counterterrorism operations. "Jesus," Coleman muttered under his breath. The woman standing in front of him wasn't just a trained soldier. She was an elite special operations warrior who had been fighting America's most dangerous enemies for years. Detective Coleman had served in the Army before becoming a police officer, and he had worked with special operations personnel during his deployment in Iraq. He knew that these individuals were selected from the top 1% of military personnel and trained to standards that pushed human capabilities to their absolute limits. The 3 men who had attacked Sarah had essentially cornered one of the most dangerous people on Earth and threatened her with violence. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight, except in this case, they hadn't even known they were in a fight until it was over. "Will there be any charges against Petty Officer Martinez?" Commander Mitchell asked. Coleman shook his head. "No charges. This is clearly justifiable self-defense. In fact, given the criminal histories of these 3 men, she probably prevented them from victimizing someone else tonight." As the ambulances prepared to transport the 3 attackers to the local hospital, Detective Coleman found himself curious about Sarah's background. He had met soldiers, Marines, and even some special operations personnel during his time in the service, but he had never encountered a female SEAL. "Can I ask you something?" Coleman said to Sarah as she prepared to leave. "How did you end up in special operations?" "It can't have been easy." Sarah smiled slightly, the first time her expression had softened all evening. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. but nothing worthwhile ever is. I wanted to serve my country at the highest level, and I was willing to do whatever it took to earn that opportunity. The training must have been incredible, Coleman continued. The training is designed to push you beyond what you think is possible, Sarah explained. It teaches you that your physical limits are mostly mental constructs. When you absolutely have to perform, when lives are on the line, you find reserves of strength and capability that you never knew existed. Detective Coleman nodded, understanding dawning in his expression. That's what happened here tonight. These guys thought they were attacking a helpless victim, but they were actually threatening someone who has been trained to handle much worse situations. Much worse, Sarah confirmed quietly. As she spoke, Coleman caught a glimpse of the warrior beneath the civilian clothes. For just a moment, he could see the steel in her eyes, the confidence that came from surviving and succeeding in the most dangerous environments on Earth. It was the look of someone who had faced death and emerged victorious, not once, but many times. The three criminals who lay unconscious in the ambulances had no idea how lucky they were to be alive. In a combat zone, Sarah's response to their threats would have been far more definitive. Her training had taught her to eliminate threats efficiently and permanently, but her discipline and professionalism had led her to use only the minimum force necessary to protect herself. One more question, Detective Coleman said as Sarah prepared to get back in her car. Do you think this will affect your willingness to travel alone? Sarah's smile became more genuine. Detective, I've traveled alone through some of the most dangerous places in the world. 3 criminals in a convenience store parking lot aren't going to change my plans. As she drove away, heading back toward the highway and her journey home, Detective Coleman found himself hoping that word of this incident would spread through the criminal community. Maybe other predators would think twice before approaching lone women on these highways, at least until they were certain those women weren't trained killers traveling in civilian clothes. The convenience store returned to normal operations, though Frank Morrison would be telling the story of what he witnessed for years to come. The 3 attackers would survive their injuries, but they would also face serious criminal charges and the knowledge that they had seriously misjudged their intended victim. For Sarah, the incident was just another reminder that the skills she had learned in the military had applications far beyond the battlefield. The training that had kept her alive in Afghanistan and Syria had served her well on a quiet highway in Middle America. But as she merged back onto the interstate, Sarah couldn't help but think about the broader implications of what had happened. Somewhere out there, other women were traveling alone, vulnerable to the same kind of predators she had encountered. They didn't have her training or capabilities, and they were depending on law enforcement and society to protect them from those who would do them harm. It was a sobering reminder of why her work, both in the military and in civilian life, mattered so much. 3 weeks after the convenience store incident, Sarah Martinez sat in the briefing room at Naval Special Warfare Development Group headquarters in Virginia Beach, preparing for her next deployment. The events of that evening had generated more paperwork and attention than she had anticipated, but the investigation had been concluded quickly once the facts were established. Detective Coleman had done his job thoroughly and professionally. His report detailed the criminal histories of the 3 attackers, the evidence from the convenience store security camera, and witness statements that clearly established Sarah's actions as justified self-defense. The case had been closed within a week, with all 3 men facing multiple felony charges for attempted robbery and assault. What Detective Coleman's report didn't include, because he didn't have access to that information, was the broader impact of Sarah's actions that night. Word of the incident had indeed spread through certain circles, both criminal and law enforcement, creating ripple effects that would be felt for months to come. In the criminal community along that stretch of highway, the story had taken on almost mythical proportions. 3 experienced criminals, all larger and apparently better armed than their target, had been defeated by a lone woman without any of them landing a single blow. The details grew more dramatic with each telling, but the core message remained consistent. Not every potential victim was as helpless as they appeared. Frank Morrison, the convenience store clerk, had become something of a local celebrity. His cell phone footage of the incident had been viewed thousands of times after being shared on social media platforms. He had given interviews to local news stations, though the military's public affairs office had ensured that Sarah's identity and specific unit assignment remained classified. The story that emerged in the media was sanitized, but still compelling. A female service member had successfully defended herself against multiple attackers while traveling alone. Women's safety advocates had used the incident to highlight the dangers faced by women traveling alone, while military supporters had pointed to it as evidence of the high quality of training provided to American service members. But for Sarah, the most significant consequence of that night had been a conversation with her commanding officer, Captain Rebecca Hayes, who had called her into her office the morning after the incident. Martinez, Captain Hayes had said, reviewing the initial police report on her computer screen, "It seems you had an interesting drive home from your sister's wedding." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah had replied simply. She had learned early in her military career that when dealing with superior officers, it was usually best to stick to the facts and avoid elaborating unless asked. Captain Hayes had leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with the kind of analytical gaze that came from years of evaluating personnel in high-stress situations. 3 attackers, all larger than you, at least one armed with a firearm. You neutralized all 3 without sustaining significant injury or requiring backup. "That's correct, ma'am." The police detective who handled the case called to verify your background. He seemed quite impressed with your capabilities. He also mentioned that he had never encountered a female SEAL before. Sarah had remained silent, unsure where the conversation was heading. Captain Hayes was known for her directness, but she was also strategic in her thinking. Every conversation with her had a purpose beyond what was immediately apparent. "You handled the situation professionally and within the bounds of appropriate force," Captain Hayes had continued. "But it also demonstrated something that we've been discussing at the command level. Your training and experience make you a valuable asset, not just in military operations, but in situations that bridge the gap between military and civilian law enforcement." That conversation had led to Sarah's current assignment. Instead of deploying to another overseas combat zone, she would be joining a joint task force focused on domestic counterterrorism operations. Her unique background and demonstrated ability to operate effectively in civilian environments made her ideal for missions that required special operations capabilities in American cities and towns. The new assignment was both challenging and rewarding. Sarah would be working with FBI counterterrorism units, local law enforcement agencies, and other military special operations personnel to identify and neutralize threats against American civilians. It was a chance to use her skills to protect innocent people in her own country rather than just overseas. Her first mission had been a success. Working with the FBI, she had helped identify and apprehend a domestic terror cell that was planning an attack on a shopping mall in North Carolina. Her ability to blend into civilian environments while maintaining the tactical awareness of a special operations professional had been crucial to the operation's success. The case had required her to pose as a customer in the targeted mall while conducting surveillance on the suspected terrorists. For 2 weeks, she had shopped, eaten lunch, and observed the daily routines of thousands of innocent civilians while simultaneously tracking the movements and activities of individuals who wanted to harm them. When the arrest operation was executed, Sarah had been positioned to provide overwatch and tactical support to the FBI arrest teams. The terrorists had been taken into custody without incident, and a significant attack had been prevented. The operation had been classified, so there was no media coverage, but Sarah knew that hundreds of innocent people were safe because of the work she and her team had done. The convenience store incident had also had personal consequences for Sarah. The story had somehow reached her hometown of San Antonio, where her family and childhood friends learned for the first time exactly what kind of work she did for the Navy. She had always been deliberately vague about her military service, citing operational security requirements, but the incident had made it impossible to maintain that fiction completely. Her sister Maria had called her immediately after seeing a news report about the incident. "Sarah, they're saying you're some kind of super soldier," Maria had said, her voice mixing amazement and concern. "Is that really what you do?" Sarah had explained as much as she was allowed to, helping her family understand that her military service involved high-level training and dangerous missions, but that she was well prepared for the challenges she faced. It had been a difficult conversation because she knew her family worried about her safety, but it had also been liberating to finally share some aspects of her life that she had kept hidden for years. Her parents had been proud, but also concerned. Her father, a retired police officer, understood the realities of dangerous work better than most civilians. He had told her that he was proud of her service and her capabilities, but that he also worried about the risks she faced every day. "Just remember," he had said during their conversation, "courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done despite being afraid. You got plenty of courage, but don't let it make you careless." The three men who had attacked Sarah that night had faced very different consequences. Marcus Webb, the largest of the group, had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for armed robbery and assault. His criminal history had worked against him during sentencing, and the judge had noted the severity of what he had attempted to do to an innocent woman. Tommy Garrett, the smaller man with a knife, had received a 6-year sentence. His drug history had been taken into consideration, and he had been ordered to undergo treatment for substance abuse as part of his rehabilitation program. His wrist had healed, but he would carry physical and psychological scars from the encounter for the rest of his life. Ryan Foster, who had pulled the gun on Sarah, had received the longest sentence, 12 years for armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and weapons violations. During his sentencing hearing, the prosecutor had noted that Foster had threatened to kill an innocent woman and had been prepared to follow through on that threat. The judge had agreed that such behavior warranted the maximum sentence allowed by law. All three men would be eligible for parole eventually, but they would also carry the knowledge that they had encountered someone far more dangerous than they could have imagined. Prison had a way of spreading stories, and their fellow inmates had been both impressed and amused by the fact that 3 grown men had been defeated by a woman half their size. The story had become a cautionary tale within the prison system, though the inmates who told it rarely understood the full context. They knew that the woman had been military, but they didn't grasp the significance of Navy special warfare training or the level of combat experience that Sarah brought to that brief encounter. Detective Coleman had used the incident as a training example for his fellow officers. During a recent tactical training session, he had presented the case as an example of how quickly situations could escalate and how important it was to accurately assess threats and capabilities. The lesson here isn't just about self-defense, Coleman had told his audience of police officers. It's about the fact that people aren't always what they appear to be. This woman looked like any other civilian, but she had training and experience that made her more dangerous than the 3 men who attacked her. He had also used the case to emphasize the importance of de-escalation and professional conduct when dealing with military personnel, especially those with special operations backgrounds. These people are trained to respond to threats with overwhelming force, he had explained. They're also trained to follow rules of engagement and use appropriate force. But if you corner them or make them fear for their lives, they will respond with capabilities that most of us can barely imagine. Frank Morrison had eventually returned to his normal routine at the convenience store, though he never forgot what he had witnessed that night. He had installed additional security cameras and improved the lighting in his parking lot, partly because of insurance requirements, but also because he wanted to deter future criminal activity. He had also begun paying more attention to his customers, especially women traveling alone. The incident had made him realize that he was often the last person to see potential victims before they encountered predators on the highway. He had developed a system of checking on solo travelers and offering to call police if anyone seemed to be following or threatening them. Morrison's heightened awareness had already paid dividends. 2 weeks after Sarah's incident, he had noticed suspicious activity involving another lone female traveler and had called police before a confrontation could occur. The potential attackers had fled when they saw police cars arriving, and another crime had been prevented. The broader impact of Sarah's actions that night continued to resonate through the special operations community as well. Her commanding officers had noted the professionalism and restraint she had shown while still effectively neutralizing multiple threats. It had become a case study in how special operations personnel should conduct themselves in civilian environments. The incident had also reinforced the military's confidence in the integration of women into special operations roles. Sarah had proven that female operators could handle unexpected threats with the same effectiveness as their male counterparts, while also demonstrating the judgment and discipline that were essential for operating in complex environments. As Sarah prepared for her next mission with the Joint Counterterrorism Task Force, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that evening at the convenience store. The incident had been a brief interruption in her journey home from a family wedding, but it had led to new opportunities and challenges that were shaping her career in unexpected ways. She was scheduled to deploy to Los Angeles the following week, where intelligence suggested that foreign operatives were planning an attack on the port facilities. Her job would be to work with local law enforcement and federal agencies to identify and neutralize the threat before it could be carried out. It was exactly the kind of mission that utilized all of her skills: surveillance, tactical analysis, precision shooting, and close-quarters combat. But it would also require her to operate in a major American city among innocent civilians who had no idea that their safety depended on people like her working in the shadows to protect them. As she packed her gear for the deployment, Sarah thought about the three men who had approached her in that parking lot 3 weeks earlier. They had seen what they thought was an easy target, but they had actually encountered someone whose life was dedicated to protecting others from people exactly like them. The irony was not lost on her. Those three predators had learned the hard way that threatening innocent people was a dangerous game, especially when they chose the wrong victim. But their mistake had also opened new doors for Sarah, allowing her to use her skills in ways that would protect countless other potential victims. In the end, their attempt to victimize her had backfired spectacularly, leading not only to their own imprisonment, but also to Sarah's enhanced ability to protect others. It was a fitting conclusion to a confrontation that had begun with three criminals making the worst decision of their lives: pressing a weapon to the head of a Navy SEAL.